preyed upon by this creature. Whether they felt that blood was being taken or merely life force. And the further you go through all of the readings of the folklore, and I strongly recommend looking for like The Phantom World by Calmaine, because it's as close to primary material as you're going to get, since most of this was pretty much oral tradition, until the actual government officials would get involved in what all of these people were getting up to. So the predation aspect is very much part of what makes this vampire as opposed to a ghost, as opposed to a zombie. There's some thing that they are taking from people, and that thing leads to lassitude and exhaustion and illness and even possibly death. So I agree with Paul Barber's idea that many of the cases of folklore vampires are definitely just people not understanding how basically diseases are passed.
Yeah, it could be anything from tuberculosis. People would cough up blood, and they would be deathly ill for such a long time and emaciated. Some of the people would recover from it, and that would scare the families all by itself. They're dying, and all of a sudden they're healthy. And they would, in some cases, people would be buried alive.
In the American instances of vampires, like Mercy Brown and stuff, they would dig the vampire up, they'd take the heart out, they'd burn the heart, and then they'd make the person that they thought the vampire was feeding off of drink the ashes to cure whatever they had caught, which I don't recommend, just as a little aside. But having dug through a lot of the folklore, every once in a while there is one of the reports that sounds like there's really something going on. It's not just, dumb backwoods peasants who are making erroneous conclusions about death or contagion. That there is a paranormal thing that at this point, there's so much distance, there's no way to really investigate it or adequately judge it. But especially the instances where they're talking about, where the person reporting it seems to be aware that it's not necessarily a physical person that is coming into their space, but it looks like the person. That even though they've locked the doors and they've closed the windows, they seem to be able to project from wherever they're coming from. And some of the apotropaics, that's the fancy word for staking a vampire or anything that you do to keep bad things from coming and getting you. Some of them definitely, there's stuff that we do when we suggest to people to cleanse their houses or to try to keep a spirit and drive it off.
Anything from covering mirrors with sheets, it's a tradition, especially during the 1800s, the Victorian period. They were afraid that your soul would be trapped in it. They would change the clock's hands. There's a lot of factors in people who are alive, and this has been since the caveman. We're always terrified of the dead coming back, no matter what type of creature it is, because we're afraid of what lies beyond. And I think that's what has fueled the terror from ancient man to now. We have that lingering worry, because no matter how evolved we are through science and spirituality, we honestly don't know.
I mean, stakes are something that we all recognize, and they definitely made their way into the fiction and the cinema, but how many people watched the X-Files episode that had vampires? And Mulder, with his sunflower seeds, throws the seeds, and the poor little vampire is compelled to count every one of them. How is it?
Michelle threatened to do this when I was visiting her one day, and something spilled on the floor, and I don't know if it was
immediately, he's just like,
my OCD kicks in, I'm starting to pick them all up, she says, aha, vampire.
And it's not just that, it's not that you die, you become a vampire, and you develop a wicked case of OCD. It's passed down from and slightly misremembered. It ties right back to that idea of the hungry dead. Most of the items that would be cast on top of the grave, with the assumption that the vampire is going to have to count those, rice, mustard seed, they're all foodstuffs.
Nuts in a bed.
The foodstuff angle suggests that these were food offerings to the dead. And that goes back way, 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 way far. The idea, again, of the hungry dead, what you do to appease them and keep them from walking is you give them things, you give them offerings. And those offerings convey some of the stuff that they need to feed themselves. And that goes as far back as Egyptian funerary traditions, where in order to keep the soul in the tomb and off doing what it needs to be doing in its little tomb life, as opposed to going out and walking among people, is you make sure that as the family member, you go there and you do the right offerings, and you give them food. Actually, if you read the liturgy of funerary offerings of Egyptian tradition, you're giving them a freaking feast, like, you know, on every day that this is a thing that you're supposed to be doing, and it's for years and years afterwards. You know, duck legs and cakes and ale and beer, they ate better than most of the other living relatives.
Yeah, I think it was kind of an offering, and it was also, you know, kind of a push to keep them where they were, because they didn't want them to come back. In some ways, in others, in honoring their ancestors. I wrote Cemetery Gates, Death and Mourning Through the Ages, and I was just talking about this stuff coming back to me, and it's like every culture has their vampire. Every culture has their own burial rites and things that they would do to help the next step for the dead to cross over, stay there, and hopefully have it not come back at all.
So a question that I'll get usually at the end of this is, okay, so are there still vampire cases, like the classic folkloric vampire case? How many of you who watched Paranormal State have seen the episode called The Glove? It's the one with the handprint on the wall. It's in Daisy Town. If you haven't seen it, that's cool. So bits that didn't clearly make it into that, and we ended up going back there a second time. It was a classic vampire case. That's my 15-minute mark, so. Let me explain why, if you saw the second episode, you see Ryan driving a nail into a grave as the sun's going down on the summer solstice. The fellow who was haunting his family, we get called in because there is a haunting. It is the husband's father. He was known as a drunk and a wife beater, and he seems to be totally okay with his son. But he does not like the wife or any of the wife's relatives, and the wife is getting sick. Like, she ended up with a life-threatening illness and a chronic illness, and she felt that she was being attacked by this and drained, and everything that she's reporting, Ryan's going over it, and I'm like, this sounds like a vampire. I'm going to look like an idiot, but this sounds like a vampire. Okay. The fellow was ethnic, sub-Carpathian Rus. So pretty much he's from the Carpathians. Like, he had immigrated, he is from Dracula land. And in their folklore, one of the things, to be read as a vampire, drunks were sometimes equated with a vampire's thirst. Somebody who was a drunk was often thought to come back as a vampire.
And a lot of alcoholics were red-faced. Yeah,
and the connections are there. So I'm like, so you've got this abusive drunk who is coming back and he's preying on the family. Even if you don't believe that this is actually like a vampire case, at least try to speak to the spirit, because he was a bugger. He was really a pain in the butt. You could try to do the standard cleansing of the house, and this guy would just come right back. He would not go away. He would not quit. And I'm like, well, we'll speak to him in language that he would understand. If he grew up in some Carpathian Rus, this is actually a folklore tradition that he understands. And so I ended up doing mad research to find, like, within his particular region, how do you put a vampire spirit to rest? How do you put a person who is this type of spirit to rest? And obviously we couldn't go to the local cemetery and dig him up and put a stake through his heart. Families tend to frown at that, and so do cemeteries these days. And we did definitely have to work within the letter of the law. So we actually had to get permission from the cemetery to even go to the grave, permission from the family to show the grave. And I'm like, okay, well, everything is, you have to transfix it. There was one really obscure thing about reciting Psalm 50 while someone walked around the graveyard with tobacco. And I'm like, well, Chad Kalick smokes like a chimney, so we got that covered. But so we took the longest nail we could find and drove it into the ground over the thing, and pretty much was like, dude, you are nailed down to your grave. I'd love to have you move on, but you're not moving on, so you can't walk anymore. And the first time we went out there, we tried the traditional methods. It didn't do anything. It just came back a couple of weeks later with just kind of like neater, which sometimes they do. that one, as ridiculous as I felt suggesting it, I mean, everyone's like, oh, come on, really? Like, we know you like vampires, but this is ridiculous. But it worked. So whether it worked because the human spirit haunting believed that that was why he was haunting, believed like that was his framework. Because I do believe when you are dealing with hauntings, if you believe that ghosts exist, if you believe that they were human, they still have human psychology. And a lot of the ways to deal with them, to get them to go away, is to appeal to that human side, to appeal to their emotional side. And you know, the vast majority of haunts really just need to go to the therapist.
Right, that's the tradition of, you know, dealing with any situation, honestly, is getting inside the head of the person you're trying to deal with, alive or dead or undead, is find out what the problem is and how to get them to cross over. I mean, that's why you have ghosts haunting a place as unresolved past issues. And I think that would apply to any of these paranormal or folkloric type entities.
So we've got 10 minutes, and we can do Q&A if anybody has questions. You?
You talking about how, you know, otherworldly things don't come out whenever it's light. What if, like, are there any kind of folklore to those kind of things around, I don't know, like the Netherlands and like places where they have like full 24 hours of daylight sometimes in the year?
Well, there's definitely a lot of folklore around things being more active at night, less active during the day. Where I found probably the best answer to that for you is in fairy lore. It's more liminal times of the day, transitional times of the day seem to have an impact on pretty much like whether or not something can come or go, cross into or out of our space. So with a lot of the Fae myths, especially in the British Isles, dawn and dusk are both times of transition, and then there's periods during the year where there are transitional times as well, the most famous being Halloween, where the walls between the worlds grow thin, and the dead, as well as other things, were believed to be able to come back. That's when you would have the dumb supper, and you would leave at least, you know, one place for the family members and acknowledge them because they could come. That's why we had jack-o'-lanterns. They weren't originally in pumpkins, but they were basically lanterns. They were there to scare off the spirits that you didn't want to stop, but they were also meant to help guide the ones that wanted to come home.
Almost like landing lights for an airplane.
Never mind, I've got a very random mind. I think the important thing to take from that is there were and still are plenty of reports of activity during the day, but certainly there's that sense that there's a greater power at night. In the lands where the sun doesn't set, that whole period where it's night but there's still light, that's a whole liminal period. I haven't delved a great deal into the folklore of those countries, but I'd be fascinated to see with like their shamanic traditions, their ideas of the blessed dead that would live in the tombs, and the Durgar and such, like how much that played into it.
I think in the reverse of what she's talking about, fiction has explored that as an alternative possibility in 30 Days of Night. You know, what happens if you're in a place that's mostly daylight, and then all of a sudden, because of the tilt and the seasons and everything, like in Alaska or something, all of a sudden you're going to have nothing but dark for a very long time. What happens when the undead all of a sudden have that much power? You know, you better get your flight out of that part of the country real quick.
Anyone else? Oh, come on, don't be shy. And say we don't bite, but some of you know that's a lie.
Okay, in the novel Dracula, there's this part that I particularly love. It's near the beginning, it's very short. And it's Jonathan, he's going through the things that make him feel uncomfortable about Dracula. And there's this moment that horrifies him completely. He sees Dracula clearing his own table. Like, after they have a meal, he sees Dracula, and to me, it's always seemed like the things, there's like a double, he's like punching two ways, that Dracula is doing servants' work,
Yeah.
but he's also doing women's work. And that this just horrifies Jonathan. I was wondering if there's more about, I mean, it's a very short part, but maybe there's more that Bram Stoker might have intended. I feel like it's kind of humorous, almost. Like
It is a little, I mean, some of the critical readings of Dracula have a lot to do with like particularly English at the time and their perceptions of anybody who was foreign, which notably Stoker was an Irishman in London. So he had a sense of like how very strict some of those ideas could be. I know that one of the just like writerly parts of that is Stoker sets up the fact that Dracula is very much alone there aside from like the three wives. So Dracula's actually the guy who's driving the coach, and Dracula's doing everything, and he's just kind of like leading Harker to believe that there's like, you know, that, but it lets him know that there's definitely something hinky up at the castle. But that idea that Dracula crosses those boundaries, which to us don't seem very, very firm, but when Stoker's writing, you still did have servants, you still had very strict gender roles and what was appropriate, what was women's work, up to and including, and you don't, actually you see this between Mina and Lucy. The idea of the Victorian fallen woman, like pretty much you had virgin or whore, and there was nothing in between. So Mina is the good, faithful wife who, even though like Dracula does that rather steamy, kind of strangely bizarre scene where he's in the bed and Jonathan's sleeping in the bed, and he grabs her and has her like lap like a kitten from the cut on his chest. Even though she's been tempted, even though she's had this, she still stays faithful to her husband. But Lucy, and they really do play it up. I'm assuming that, especially like in Bram Stoker's Dracula, they understand this. Like Lucy, suddenly her hair is loose. There was a thing about, like, if you were a loose woman, you wore your hair loose, you had your tresses long, and so playing up a lot of those tensions.
The Victorian period was nothing but sexual repression, and also at the same time, like she's talking about changes in the climate, I'm speaking climate socially. Keep in mind the Victorian period, like the Penny Dreadful TV show, it's almost a resistance against modernity. The industrial age was about to happen, and a lot of people did not want to abandon the old ways or mentalities for what was around the corner.
Penny Dreadful, does a really good job of like pulling all of the tropes in and just playing with them, like seriously playing with them.
And I honestly think the repressed sexuality of the Victorian period, where they flaunted the seduction, actually was like our modern soap opera in a way, where they were just kind of dangling the idea of what it could be, and that heightened the interest.
Well, a couple of like neat notes, and I find that our brains tend to edit it out, that Stoker takes from folklore, puts on Dracula, but like nobody remembers that he's got like hair on his palms, which is one of the things that was supposed to be a sign not of somebody who, but of a vampire, or like their brows would meet over their eyes. But I don't know many people who even like